Evening, friends. The fire's burning low tonight, and I don't mind it one bit. There's just enough glow left in these coals to warm the backs of my hands. And that suits me fine. The wood's gone soft now, crumbled into those pale shapes that hold the heat without making much fuss about it. Every now and again, a little orange line crawls along the edge of a log, quiet as a seam of copper in the rock, and then it fades again. That's the kind of fire I like best. One that don't need tending. One you can just sit beside and let be. The air out here has that particular bite to it tonight. Not the sharp kind that stings your nose and makes you pull your collar tight, but the slower kind, the kind that settles into your coat and your knees and reminds you, real patient-like, that winter's still got a say in things. I pulled this old blanket across my lap about an hour ago, and I haven't moved much since. Haven't needed to. The sky above Cottonwood Creek is wide open, and the stars are so thick and still that they look like someone scattered flour across a dark kitchen table. No wind to speak of. Just the faintest movement in the juniper behind me. Like the branches are breathing in their sleep. I've been sitting here a good while now, long enough that the coyotes off toward the mesa have gone quiet. Long enough that the creek has started to sound louder than it did before, the way it does when everything else hushes. Water moving over the same stones it's been moving over since before I was born. That sound don't change. It's one of the things I've come to count on. Not the kind of counting you do with numbers or debts, but the deeper kind, where you lean into a thing because it's always been there and you trust it'll stay. Cottonwood Creek is the sort of place that gets into your bones. I've lived here most all my life, and I reckon I'll be here till the last of it too. I've walked the same stretch of Main Street so many thousands of times that I could do it blind. I know where the boardwalk dips near Harlan's old mercantile. I know the way the railing outside the post office leans just a hair to the south on account of that mule that backed into it in '79 and nobody ever bothered to set it straight again. I know which planks creak and which ones don't. And I know that the third step up to the jail porch has a loose nail that I've been meaning to fix for going on 11 years now. But tonight, I'm not thinking about summer walks or autumn patrols. Tonight, my mind keeps drifting back to a winter. One winter in particular, the winter of 1891. Now, snow in Cottonwood Creek is a rare thing. We get cold, sure. We get frost on the horse troughs and ice along the edges of the creek in January. But actual snow, the kind that falls soft and steady and covers things, that's something else entirely. Most years it passes us by. The storms roll through the higher country to the north, or spend themselves out over the Sangre de Cristos before they ever reach our little valley. We watch the clouds from a distance and go about our business, and by morning, the sky is clear and dry again, same as always. But that year was different. I was deputy then, working under Sheriff Amos Ketchum, who was a quiet man with a slow walk and a habit of chewing the end of a matchstick whenever he was thinking something over. Amos didn't say much, and that was one of the things that made him good at his job. Folks trusted him because he didn't waste words. When he did speak, you listened, not because his voice was loud, but because it was steady. He had a way of looking at you with those pale gray eyes of his that made you feel like he was reading a letter you'd written to yourself and never meant to send. I'd been deputy for about 4 years by that point, long enough that the work had settled into me, the way dust settles into the grain of a wooden floor. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't adventure. It was routine, and I'd come to love it for that very reason. There's a kind of comfort in knowing what the day's gonna ask of you before it asks. You wake before dawn, you check the stove, you pull on your boots and your coat and your hat, and you step out into whatever the morning's decided to offer. Some days, it's gold light creeping over the ridgeline. Some days, it's gray and still. And once, just once, it was snow. I remember the evening before it came. There was something in the air, something I couldn't name at the time, but recognized later as a kind of heaviness. Not the heaviness of a thunderstorm. That's a different animal altogether, all pressure and charge, and the smell of wet iron. This was gentler, like the sky had taken a long breath in and was holding it. The temperature dropped through the afternoon in a slow, steady way, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, but just keeps arriving, degree by degree, until you realize your fingers have gone stiff around the handle of your coffee cup, and you can see your breath hanging in the still air, like a little ghost that don't want to leave. I was sitting on the jail porch that evening, which was a thing I did most nights when the weather allowed it. The jail wasn't much to look at. A squat adobe building with a flat roof and 2 cells in the back that were empty more often than not. The porch out front was made of rough-cut pine that had gone silver with age, and there was one chair, a ladder back with a woven seat that Amos had gotten from somewhere and never explained. I'd claimed it as mine through the simple act of sitting in it more than anyone else. And after a while, folks just accepted it. That's how most things work in a small town. You don't own something by buying it. You own it by being the one who's always there. The street was emptying out early that night. I noticed it because there's usually a little more lingering in the evenings. Someone standing outside the general store, passing a few words with a neighbor, or a pair of ranch hands walking slow toward the saloon with their hats pushed back and their hands in their pockets. But that night, folks were moving with purpose, heads down, heading indoors. Mrs. Avery closed the door of her dress shop a full hour before she usually did. I saw her through the window, lighting a lamp and pulling the curtains. And something about that small, quiet gesture made me feel like the town was tucking itself in. Old Hector Garza, who ran the livery, came walking up Main Street with a horse blanket folded over his arm. He stopped when he saw me on the porch. "Gonna be a cold one," he said, and that was all. He touched the brim of his hat, the way men do when they've said what they came to say, and walked on toward the stable. I watched him go. His boots made soft sounds on the packed dirt, and then he turned the corner and was gone, and the street was empty. I sat there a while longer, listening. There's a particular sound a town makes when it's settling down for the night. It's not silence exactly. It's more like the sound between sounds. The creak of a shutter, the distant clank of a stove door, a dog barking once and then deciding against it. The last thin ribbon of light along the western ridge was the color of old copper, and then it was gone too, and the sky turned that deep, bruised blue that comes just before full dark. I went inside and stoked the stove in the office. The iron was warm to the touch already, but I added another split of piñon anyway. because something in my gut told me the night was going to ask for more heat than usual. The wood caught quick and sent up that sweet, resinous smell that I've always associated with winter in this part of the country. It's a clean smell, not sharp like cedar or heavy like oak, but somewhere in between, warm and dry and faintly sweet, like the desert itself had figured out a way to make perfume. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. The coffee was old and strong and had been sitting there since mid-afternoon, which meant it had that particular thickness to it, almost chewy, the way camp coffee gets when it's been forgotten. I didn't mind. I've never been particular about coffee. If it's hot and dark and bitter, it'll do the job. I took the cup back out to the porch. The cold had deepened while I was inside, and when I stepped through the door, it pressed against my face like a cool hand. I could feel it in my ears, in the tips of my fingers where they wrapped around the tin cup. The steam from the coffee rose in a thin, curling line and disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the dry air. And then I looked up. The sky had changed. Where it had been clear an hour before, stars scattered thick and careless across the dark. Now there was a kind of softness to it, a blurring. The stars along the northern horizon had gone hazy, as if someone had drawn a thin cloth across that part of the sky. The air smelled different too, not the sharp metallic smell of a desert frost, but something rounder, something with a kind of dampness at its edges that I couldn't quite place. I stood there on that porch, cup in both hands, and I watched that soft edge of cloud move across the sky, so slowly that you couldn't really see it moving unless you picked a star and waited. One by one, the stars near the horizon went out, quiet as candles, pinched between wet fingers. The blurring crept southward, thickening as it came, until the whole northern quarter of the sky was just a pale, low-hanging curtain of gray. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the coffee to go from too hot to just right, and then past that into lukewarm, which is the only temperature of coffee I truly dislike. I drank it anyway because wasting coffee felt wrong even when it wasn't good anymore, and I kept my eyes on that sky. The first flake came down so quiet, I almost missed it. It landed on the porch railing, just to the left of my hand. A single white speck, no bigger than a shirt button, and it sat there for a moment on the gray wood, perfect and whole, before it melted into a tiny dark spot of moisture. I stared at it the way you'd stare at a word you'd heard 100 times but suddenly couldn't remember the meaning of. Then another came, and another. They fell slow and separated first, each one taking its own path down through the still air, drifting this way and that, like they couldn't quite make up their minds where to land. I held out my hand, palm up, and watched one settle onto the back of my thumb. It was so light I couldn't feel it at all. Just saw it there, a tiny white crystal, six-pointed and impossibly delicate. And then it was gone, turned to nothing by the warmth of my skin. The snow came on gradual, the way a conversation comes on between two people who haven't seen each other in a long time. At first it was just a few words, tentative, feeling things out, then a few more. Then a steady, quiet exchange that didn't need to rush anywhere because there was nowhere else to be. Within the hour, the air was full of it. Not thick, not urgent, but steady, a soft white curtain fallen between me and the rest of the world. I set my empty cup on the railing and stepped off the porch onto Main Street. The dirt road had already started to change. There was a thin dusting across the surface, not enough to cover it entirely, but enough to soften the edges of the wheel ruts and the hoof prints and the boot marks that crisscrossed the ground. The snow lay in the low places first, filling in the small depressions and the cracks in the hardpack, so that the street looked like someone had taken a fine white powder and sifted it careful into every little hollow and groove. My boots left prints as I walked, clear, dark shapes against the pale ground. I could hear the snow when I stood still, not the falling of it, because each flake was too small and too soft to make a sound on its own, but the collective whisper of thousands of them landing together on wood and dirt and stone. It was the quietest sound I'd ever heard. Quieter than silence, somehow, because silence is the absence of sound, and this was the presence of something so gentle it barely existed. I walked to the center of the street and stood there. The buildings on either side, the mercantile, the barber shop, the assay office with its faded green shutters, all looked different with the snow coming down in front of them. The edges had gone soft. The lamplight that leaked from a few windows caught the flakes as they passed and turned them gold for just a moment before they fell back into whiteness. The hitching posts along the boardwalk were gathering a thin line of white along their tops, like someone had laid a piece of string across each one. I pulled my coat tighter and stood there in the middle of Cottonwood Creek's Main Street, alone, watching the snow settle over everything I knew. There was no sound from the saloon. Usually, even on a quiet night, you could hear something. The low murmur of voices, the clink of a glass, maybe a few bars of piano if Clyde Mackey had enough whiskey in him to feel musical. But that night, even the saloon had gone still. The windows glowed warm and yellow, but the sound that should have come with that light had been swallowed up by the snow. It was as if the whole town had agreed, without anyone saying a word, to just be quiet and let this happen. I started walking again, not because I had anywhere to go, but because walking was what I did. It was my job and my habit and my way of knowing that everything was as it should be. Even on a night like this, when the world had decided to do something unexpected, the walk was the same. Down Main Street to the south end, past the blacksmith shop, past the feed store with its wide double doors latched shut, past the little house where the widow Pemberton lived with her 3 cats and her collection of pressed wildflowers. Then across to the east side and back up, checking doors and windows as I went, not because I expected to find anything amiss, but because the check-in was the point. The boardwalk on the east side of the street had a slight overhang from the roofs of the buildings above, and the snow hadn't reached the planks there yet. My boots went from the soft crunch of snow on dirt to the familiar hollow tap of wood, and then back again when I crossed an alley. The sound kept changing, and I liked that, the way the walk told me where I was, even if I closed my eyes. Snow dirt, wood snow. Each surface had its own voice under my feet. I stopped outside the general store and rested my hand on the door latch. It was cold iron under my fingers, and there was already a fine dust of snow across the top of the latch plate. I pressed down gently, felt the familiar resistance, confirmed it was locked, and moved on. This was the rhythm of the patrol. Touch and check, touch and check. Each door a small reassurance. Each locked latch a quiet promise that things were in order and the people behind those doors were warm and safe and didn't need anything from me tonight except the knowledge that someone was out here walking. Keeping watch. The snow was falling thicker now, not heavier. Each flake was still that same small, weightless thing, but there were more of them, and they came closer together so that the air between me and the end of the street had turned into a kind of soft, white haze. I could still see the buildings and the lampposts and the shape of the old cottonwood tree at the south end of town, but everything beyond that had disappeared into a pale, luminous blur. The world had gotten smaller, and I didn't mind. Cottonwood Creek was all the world I needed on a night like that. I turned the corner at the south end and headed up the west side. The barber shop was dark, its striped pole barely visible under a dusting of white. Next to it was Doc Alderman's office, where a single lamp burned in the back room. I could see its glow through the frosted glass of the front window, warm and steady, and I knew that meant that Doc was up, probably reading one of those medical journals he had shipped in from St. Louis every few months. Doc Alderman was one of those men who never seemed to sleep, not because he was restless, but because there was always something in a book that interested him more than his pillow. I'd see his light on at midnight, at 2 in the morning, at 4. Sometimes I'd tap on his window as I passed, just a light rap with one knuckle, and he'd look up from his book and nod at me through the glass. And that was our whole conversation. A tap and a nod. It was enough. I didn't tap that night. I don't know why. Maybe because the snow had made everything feel so hushed that even a small sound seemed like too much. Or maybe because I didn't want to break whatever spell had settled over the town along with the flakes. I just looked at his window as I passed, saw the lamp, saw the faint shape of his head bent over his desk, and kept walking. The snow was starting to accumulate in earnest now. The hitching posts had an inch of it along their tops, and the boardwalk on the west side, which had no overhang, was covered in a thin, even layer that made my boots leave perfect prints. I looked back at my tracks stretching behind me in a line, dark footprints on a white page, and it occurred to me that by morning, they'd be filled in again, covered over, as if I'd never been there at all. There was something peaceful in that thought, not sad, just peaceful. The way the world keeps covering things over, gentle and patient, not because it wants to erase you, but because it's always making room for what comes next. I reached the north end of Main Street, where the road curved slightly, and headed out toward the open country. From here, on a clear night, you could see the low hills to the north and the faint, dark line of the mesa beyond them. But tonight, there was nothing out there but white. The snow had drawn a curtain across the edge of town, and beyond it was just a soft, luminous emptiness that seemed to go on forever. I stood at that boundary for a while, the town behind me, the open world ahead, and I felt the way you feel when you're standing in a doorway, not quite in one room, not quite in another. A horse nickered from somewhere in the direction of the livery. A soft, low sound, muffled by the snow. I turned toward it, instinctive, the way you turn toward any sound when the world's gone quiet, and listened. Another nicker, then silence. Just one of Hector's horses shifting in its stall, adjusting to the cold, maybe pressing its flank against a wooden wall for warmth, maybe just talking to itself the way horses do sometimes, those small sounds that aren't meant for anyone but seem to say, "I'm here, I'm here." I decided to walk over to the livery, not because I was worried about the horses. Hector took good care of his animals, better than most men took care of themselves, but because the sound had pulled me that direction. And on a night like this, I was happy to let small things guide me. The livery was set back from Main Street, down a narrow side lane that was barely wide enough for a wagon. The lane had gone white, and my boots sank a little deeper here, where the dirt was softer. The livery doors were shut but not latched. Hector always left them loose in case he needed to get in quick, and I pushed one open just enough to slip inside. The smell hit me first, hay and horse and leather, and the warm, heavy scent of animal bodies in an enclosed space. After the cold, clean air outside, it was like walking into a different season. The warmth was immediate and close, not the dry warmth of a stove, but the damp, living warmth of breath and muscle and blood. I could hear the horses breathing, 3 of them in their stalls, each one a different tempo. One was slow and deep, already asleep, or close to it. Another was quicker, restless, maybe the one that had nickered. The third was somewhere in between, steady and calm, the kind of breathing that tells you an animal is awake but content. I didn't light a lamp. There was enough moonlight coming through the cracks in the walls, or maybe it was snowlight, that strange diffused brightness that snow gives back to the air even at night to see the shapes of things. The stalls, the tack hanging on the wall, the big water barrel in the corner with a thin skin of ice across its surface. I walked to the nearest stall and rested my arms on the top rail. The horse inside was a dun mare that belonged to one of the ranch families east of town. She turned her head toward me and blew a warm breath across my forearm. I could feel the heat of it through my sleeve. Her eyes caught what little light there was and held it. 2 dark, liquid circles that seemed to look right through me and find whatever they were looking for. I stood there with that horse for a long time. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. She went back to her hay after a while, and I listened to the sound of her chewing, that slow, rhythmic grind that horses make when they're working through a mouthful of dry grass. It's one of the most settling sounds in the world, I think. It says that everything's all right, that the basic work of living is going on, the same tonight as it was last night, the same as it'll be tomorrow. There's no worry in it, no hurry, just a creature doing what creatures do, taking what the world offers and making it enough. When I stepped back outside, the snow had deepened. The lane between the livery and Main Street was covered now, 2 inches at least, smooth and untouched except for my own tracks going in. I followed them back, stepping in the same prints like a man reading his own letter for the second time. And when I reached the street, I stopped again. Cottonwood Creek looked like a different town. The rooftops had gone white. The boardwalks, the railings, the water trough outside the mercantile. Everything had been softened and quieted by this thin, patient layer of snow. The buildings that I'd looked at every day for years, so familiar that I'd stopped really seeing them, were suddenly new again. The angles were gentler. The rough edges were hidden. Even the old cottonwood at the south end of the street, with its bare winter branches reaching up like the fingers of an open hand, had a dusting of white along its limbs that made it look like something from a picture in a book. The lampposts along the street, we had 3 of them, oil-fed, and it was part of my job to keep them lit. Through circles of golden light onto the snow. And in those circles, the flakes were visible, each one catching the glow as it fell, turning bright for an instant before passing beyond the light and disappearing into the general whiteness below. I watched them for a long time. Each flake took its own path. None of them fell straight. They drifted and turned, and sometimes seemed to rise for a moment before continuing down, as if they were in no hurry to land and were enjoying the trip. I walked back to the jail porch and sat down in my chair. The seat was cold, and the snow on the armrests soaked through my sleeves when I set my arms down, but I didn't care. I pulled my hat down a little lower and settled in and just watched. The street was mine, not in any legal or official sense. I was a deputy, not a king, but in the way that a place belongs to whoever's there to witness it. And on that night, at that hour, with the snow coming down and every soul in Cottonwood Creek tucked behind closed doors and drawn curtains, I was the only witness. The town was performing its quietest act, and I was the only one in the audience. I thought about going inside. The stove was warm, and there was still coffee on it, and my bed, such as it was, a narrow cot in the back room with a wool blanket and a flat pillow, was calling to me in the distant way that beds do when you're tired but not quite ready to give in to it. But I stayed. I stayed because something told me that this wasn't the kind of night you sleep through. This was the kind of night you sit with, the way you sit with a friend who's come a long way to visit and might not come again for years. The snow kept falling, the town kept sleeping, and I kept watching. Somewhere around what I guessed was midnight. I didn't have a watch, and the clock in the office had stopped working months before. I noticed that the snow had started to slow. The flakes were still coming, but they were thinner now, more spread out, with longer pauses between them. The air was clearing just slightly, and I could see a little farther down the street than I could before. The lamplight reached deeper into the darkness, and the soft white haze that had surrounded everything began to lift like a curtain being drawn aside an inch at a time. I got up from the chair and stretched. My knees complained the way they always do when I've been sitting too long in the cold, and my lower back had that dull, familiar ache that comes with age and too many years of sleeping on surfaces that weren't designed for comfort. But my body still worked. It moved when I told it to. It carried me where I needed to go, and that night it carried me back out into the street one more time. The snow was maybe 3 inches deep now. Not much by the standards of places that get real winters, up in the mountains or back east or anywhere north of the Platte, but for Cottonwood Creek, it was a revelation. 3 inches of snow on a town that sometimes went years without seeing a single flake. Every surface had been transformed. The town I knew so well had put on a disguise, and I was walking through it like a man exploring a familiar room in the dark, recognizing things by shape and feel rather than by sight. I walked the full length of Main Street one more time, slow, taking it in. The snow squeaked under my boots now, that faint, dry sound that cold snow makes when you compress it almost like the sound of a finger rubbed across clean glass. Each step was deliberate. I wasn't patrolling anymore. I wasn't checking doors or listening for trouble. I was just walking, the way a man walks through a garden or along a shore, without purpose, without destination. Just moving through the world because the world had made itself worth moving through. At the south end of the street, I stopped under the cottonwood tree. Its branches arched overhead like the ribs of a cathedral, bare and dark against the pale sky. Snow had gathered in the crooks where the branches met the trunk and along the tops of the thicker limbs, and it gave the old tree a look of quiet dignity, like an old man who's put on his best coat for an occasion he wasn't expecting. I reached up and touched one of the lower branches. The bark was cold and rough under my fingers, and when I gave it a gentle shake, a small cascade of snow came down in a soft white shower that landed on my hat and shoulders and melted almost instantly. I walked back to the jail porch, and this time I went inside. I fed the stove another piece of wood and stood beside it for a while, warming my hands, feeling the heat soak into my fingers and up to my wrists. The office was small and plain. A desk with a ledger on it, 2 chairs, the gun rack on the wall, a calendar from the territorial bank that was 2 months behind because I kept forgetting to tear off the pages. The lamp was turned low, and the light it gave was the color of old honey. I liked it that way, bright enough to see by, dim enough to rest in. I sat down at the desk and opened the ledger. This was another part of the routine, the writin'. Every night, or most nights, I'd record what had happened during my patrol. It was usually brief, checked all doors, all secure, no disturbances. Sometimes, lamp on post, 2 burned low, refilled. Or, dog loose on South End, returned to Perkins' residence. Small things, the kind of things that don't matter to anyone except the person writing them down. And maybe, not even then, but I wrote them because the writing was part of the ritual, and the ritual was part of what made the work feel real and worth doing. That night, I sat with the pen in my hand for a long time before I wrote anything. The ink had gone cold and thick in the little glass well, and I had to warm it between my palms before it would flow proper. When I finally put the nib to paper, I wrote just a few words. Snow tonight, 3 inches by midnight. Town quiet. All secure. I looked at those words for a while. They didn't seem like enough. They didn't capture the way the flakes had drifted in the lamplight, or the sound the town made when it was holding its breath, or the way the dun mare's eyes had looked at me in the dark of the livery. But that was all right. Some things aren't meant to be written down. They're meant to be carried, quiet-like, in the part of you that remembers without needing words. I closed the ledger and set the pen aside. Then I went to the window and looked out one more time. The snow had nearly stopped. Just a few flakes still drifting down. Stragglers, the last ones to arrive at a party that was already winding down. The street was still and white and perfect in the lamplight, and I stood there at that window with my hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee. I'd poured another one, couldn't help it, and I let myself feel something that I didn't have a name for then, and still don't have a name for now. It wasn't happiness, exactly, though there was happiness in it. It wasn't sadness, though maybe there was a thread of that too. The kind of sadness that comes from knowing that a beautiful thing is temporary and you're watching it in the very act of passing. It was more like a kind of fullness, a sense that this moment, right here, the snow, the silence, the lamplight, the warm cup, the small dark office, the sleeping town, was complete. That nothing needed to be added or taken away. That I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, and the world, for once, agreed. I finished the coffee. I turned down the lamp. I pulled off my boots and hung my coat on the peg by the door and lay down on the cot in the back room. The wool blanket was rough against my chin, and the pillow was flat as a saddle blanket, and the springs underneath me creaked every time I shifted my weight. But I was warm. The stove ticked softly as the metal expanded, and through the thin wall I could hear the faintest sound of snow still falling, or maybe it was just the silence itself, which had taken on a texture, a presence, like something you could reach out and touch. I closed my eyes, and I thought about how strange it was that a thing as small as snow could change a whole town, not in any permanent way. By afternoon the next day, most of it would be gone, melted back into the dirt and the dust, and Cottonwood Creek would look the same as it always did. But for one night, for those few hours between dusk and dawn, the town had been something else. Something that reminded me of what the world might look like if it decided just once to be gentle with everything it touched. I slept well that night, deep and dreamless, the way you sleep when you've walked a long time in cold air, and your body's earned its rest. And when I woke, it was to the sound of dripping. The dawn came in gray and quiet. I could tell before I opened my eyes that the sky was overcast, because the light that seeped through the window had that flat, even quality that clouded mornings have. No shadows, no warmth, just a pale glow that made everything look like it had been drawn in pencil. I lay on the cot for a while, listening. The dripping was steady, snow melting off the roof, running down the eaves, falling in fat drops onto the ground below. Each drop made a small, wet sound when it landed, and together they made a rhythm that was almost musical, if music could be made entirely of water and gravity. I got up slow. My joints were stiffer than usual, which I took as a sign that the cold had been deeper than I'd realized. I pulled on my boots. They were cold and stiff, too. The leather contracted overnight and shrugged into my coat and went to the stove. The fire had burned down to a bed of ash with a few orange coals nestled in the center, and I fed it carefully, starting with thin strips of kindling and then adding a split of piñon when the flame took hold. The wood caught and crackled, and the warmth began to spread through the small room like a hand opening slowly. I put the coffee on and went to the front door. Main Street was beautiful. The snow lay across everything in a smooth, unbroken layer, and in the gray morning light, it glowed with a faint blue-white luminescence that made the buildings and the boardwalks and the hitching posts look like they'd been carved from something softer than wood and adobe. The tracks I'd left the night before were still there, darker lines in the white surface, but they were softer now, their edges rounded by the last of the snowfall and the beginning of the melt. They looked like the tracks of someone who'd been there a long time ago, not just hours before. No one was out yet. The town was still holding on to the quiet of the night, reluctant to let it go. I could see a few threads of smoke rising from chimneys, straight up into the still air, because there was no wind at all, and I knew that behind those walls, people were waking up, stoking their own stoves, putting on their own coffee, maybe looking out their own windows and seeing what I was seeing, and feeling some version of what I was feeling. I stepped off the porch and into the street. The snow compressed under my boots with that same dry squeak, and I walked slow, leaving fresh tracks beside the old ones. The air was cold but not bitter. It had that soft, damp quality that comes when the temperature is just barely below freezing, and the world can't quite decide whether to hold on to winter or let it go. My breath came out in thin white clouds that hung in front of my face for a moment before dissolving. I walked to the water trough outside the mercantile. It was covered in snow, and I brushed it off with my gloved hand, revealing the dark wood beneath. The water inside was frozen solid, a flat, gray-white disk of ice that I could see my reflection in, dim and warped. Like looking at yourself through old glass. I tapped it with my knuckle, and it rang, high and clear, a small bell sound that carried in the still air and then faded. The first person I saw that morning was young Thomas Bell, who worked at the feed store and was always the first one to his post, rain or shine, or apparently, snow. He came around the corner of the building with his collar pulled up and his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, and when he saw the street, he stopped. Just stopped, right there on the boardwalk, and stared. He looked at me, I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly, the way you do when the world has surprised you and you don't have words for it yet. "Something, ain't it?" he said. "It is," I said, and that was that. He went on to the feed store, and I went on with my walk, and the day began the way days do, not with any fanfare or announcement, but with the small, ordinary motions of people getting on with the business of living. By mid-morning, the snow was already going. The sun never came out proper. The clouds held all day, low and flat, and the color of an old bed sheet, but the temperature crept up just enough. The snow softened first, losing its dry brightness and turning dark and heavy with moisture. Then it started to shrink, pulling back from the edges of things, retreating toward the centers of rooftops and the shaded sides of buildings. The street went patchy, white here, dark mud there, and by afternoon, it was mostly gone. Just a few stubborn islands of white in the shadows where the sun, if there'd been any, wouldn't have reached anyway. I watched it go with the same attention I'd given its arrival. There was no regret in it. Snow isn't meant to stay in a place like Cottonwood Creek. It visits. It changes things for a little while. Then it moves on, and the town returns to itself. The dust, the dry air, the wide sky, the same old boardwalks, and the same old hitching posts, and the same old railing that still leans a hair to the south. The snow doesn't take anything when it leaves. It just reminds you that the world has more than one face. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and lucky enough and willing to stand out in the cold with a cup of bad coffee, you get to see one that you've never seen before. That evening, I sat on the jail porch again. The snow was gone from the street, but I could still see traces of it. A thin white line along the top of the fence behind the general store. A small pale patch under the cottonwood tree, where the shade had kept the melt at bay. The air was warmer than the night before, and the sky was clearing from the west, showing a strip of deep orange along the horizon where the sun was setting behind the clouds. Amos came out and sat on the step beside me. He had his matchstick in the corner of his mouth, and he chewed it slowly, the way he always did when he was thinking. We sat there for a while without talking. The light faded. The first stars appeared in the clearing sky. A coyote called from somewhere out toward the mesa, a single long note that rose and fell, and then was gone. "Some night," Amos said. "Some night," I agreed. He got up after a while and went inside. I heard him pour himself a cup of coffee and settle into his chair. The lamp in the office came on, throwing a warm rectangle of light through the doorway and across the porch boards. I stayed outside a little longer, watching the last of the daylight drain from the sky. I didn't know then that I'd still be sitting on that same stretch of porch 30-some years later, or that I'd still be living in the same town, walking the same streets, listening to the same creek, running over the same stones. I didn't know that I'd grow old here, that my knees would stiffen, and my hair would go white, and my hands would develop that fine tremor that comes from too many cold mornings and too many cups of coffee held for too long. All I knew was that I'd seen something beautiful that night, something quiet and unexpected and entirely itself, and that I was glad I'd been awake to see it.